So we're going to dive right into our part 3 of today's series. And as you know, our series is Intergenerational Trauma, Resilience, and Collective Healing. And particularly today, we'll be doing interventions, approaches to nurturing resilience and collective care. And so the first part of the series really was around intergenerational trauma, around the work and details around how it shows up in racialized traumatization, colonization, systems of oppression, etc., and how that's interconnected into communities and communities of color particularly, and the ways that that has kind of even indoctrinated into our systems and the way that it shows up in that way. Part 2 is really around neurobiology, epigenetics, as well as the connection between that and the behavioral, emotional, like physical, somatic aspects. And so really looking at the links between those pieces as they connect with us individually and in community with others. And obviously today, we're really looking at interventions, approaches, and nurturing resilience, collective care. And before we get started, of course, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. So something we'll be taking away today together is that you'll be able to articulate approaches towards resilience, building collective healing practices, as well as available treatment options. So this is where we ended 2 weeks ago. And the question really came down to kind of went through this whole process around how we're affected 3 generations specifically we talked about. And are we able to heal from intergenerational trauma? Yes. And there was a slide that I showed specifically around treatment for intergenerational EMDR. It was a particular modality that I do in my practice. And we showed through 5 particular treatments the distinction and difference between what was showing up in the brain around hyperactivity and overstimulation. And one thing I wanted to know and to kind of reiterate is that this is a MRI on a brain scan of a brain that's not currently stimulated, meaning they weren't necessarily exposed to something traumatic or scary, or they weren't watching anything that was causing this stimulation, right? This was the baseline of the individual going into the MRI at their current state, and just sort of indicating and showing that the parasympathetic system or sympathetic system is active, even despite a baseline. And so really seeing kind of the treatment after and noticing that there's a kind of equilibrium and level of management within their brain activity that was really within the realm of normacy. So that's great news. So let's talk about some practices and treatment. And I just also want to note that there are many different kinds of modalities. And when we talk about practices and treatment, there's a lot of things that work for a lot of different people, right? And so there's therapy, but there's actually a huge array of support and ways to build in care and healing. And listening into what that is for you, your clients, your friends, your communities, and in your own Indigenous and connected practices. So something I want to note and name is some best practices when we're thinking about and connecting with intergenerational trauma. And I do want to note that if you are not a practitioner, please do not start engaging in these kinds of supportive treatments for folks that are like your family members, even though I completely understand the urge and want to do that. I also want to note that you want to be mindful of that, right? Because it can cause re-traumatization when folks in our family, for example, aren't ready to talk about their past, or they may never want to talk about their past, right? There's a reason why they may have suppressed some of the challenges that have happened in their life. And as people, right, we need to respect and honor and really gain consent around that engagement. And so I think that's the piece to think about for you is, how do you gain that consent with them? Like, it may sound something like, I'm really wanting to learn about our family and what's happened in our lineage. It's going to help me kind of help me heal my wounds or help me figure out who I am, and also the way that I want to be able to talk to my kids, if you have children, about that. And you can see, right, where your grandparents or other family members may be sitting with that. And they may say, like, that happened a long time ago. And I actually never want to talk about it again. And so we respect that, right? And I also want to note that healing can happen even without those stories. And sometimes I get this question a lot, actually, which is like, well, how am I supposed to heal my experience or what's happened to me if I'm not able to get the full narrative or the story? And what I would say to that is the lineage of your experience lives within you. And where it is within you is a place that you can start and to continue as you move, as it, the next generation, or as we're connecting with others, your children and other folks. And so it's worthwhile that you're acknowledging it and present with this. So with that being said, bringing to light what is being behind the unspoken. What we see is that there's a lot of secrets, right? And the secrets really can eat away at us internally and in our community, right? Things that are unspoken that really need to be spoken. So an acknowledgement, putting to words, asking questions, naming what is present and occurring now, noticing things that may be happening within you, such as over functioning, over explaining, over apologizing, oversharing, are trauma responses. They're not talked about as a particular trauma responses like fight, flight, freeze, etc. But these are trauma responses. And there's reasons why these things are happening and how they may show up. And so something you may note is just paying attention, like, oh, am I over functioning? What is the purpose of that? Why is that happening? And is there a way that I can recalibrate what may be happening in this moment? Providing space for anger. This is so important, right? Your anger is so valid. And I think in our society, we have a lot of fear around anger, and we try to stifle that emotion. And seeing if we can have a little bit of a neutral stance with anger the way we have about other emotions, right? And I think sometimes big emotions in general, it could be like deep sense of grief, right? People and communities don't always know how to hold it. But when we look back at communities of culture, indigenous practices, there's beautiful space for grief, right? There's rituals that are really supportive and amazing and needed, right, in our healing. So that we move it through your body. And that's something we're really going to be talking about today. So providing space for anger. Anger is valid, and being able to see if we can have space for it like we do other emotions. Psychoeducational topics such as systemic racism, oppression, colonization, or colonized trauma, as it pertains to communities of color, immigrant and refugee populations, LGBTQ+, and or specific BIPOC communities you're working with. And I talk about this context around, like, we're not going to know everything about everything, right? Like, we may not even be in a position to psychoeducate about these topics. And so a lot of times we're actually getting resources, right? We're reading books, we're connecting ourselves or others with resources that are supportive of learning this information. And you're not going to learn it all at once. And it's a lot. So part of this is, as you're learning and gaining this information, calibrating how you're doing with it too. Because, one of the things that I notice is that we can be overstimulated. Oftentimes we're overstimulated, right? Because I think in our society, we're really set up with this constant stimulation of information. And so one of the things I've been working with folks around is how to slow down, with my students as well, right? How do we slow down so that we can actually receive the information? And so as you're having this like thirst for knowledge and wanting to take everything in, also check in with yourself around, like, okay, is this actually going in? How am I doing with this? Because I know that it matters to you, right? To gain that and to receive it. Some other aspects I really want to talk about. This is actually from the first presentation. I talked about common emotional states that arise and within intergenerational trauma, and shame, rage, grief, and guilt are common ones that show up. And these are intense emotional states. I also want to say that, right? And to also know, like, that may very well come up. And if I'm seeing it, experiencing it, noticing it, it's actually really normal, right? And with these particular emotions, sometimes we're like, whew, I don't know how to tackle that. Like, what do I do with it? So really allowing space for it to be okay to feel these emotions. And again, I mentioned this with anger. I mentioned again with these because what happens when we feel guilt? We feel guilt about feeling guilt, or we feel shame, and we feel like our shame is affecting our ability to engage with other people. And so a lot of these emotions that we're talking about here can actually cyclically spiral. And so that's something and that's important to note, right? Because there's such intense experiences that not giving space for it when we're afraid of it can actually perpetuate its growth around it. So something to just allow yourself to acknowledge that it's really okay, and really starting there. Like, it's okay that I'm angry. It's okay that you feel shame, right? Shame is not a foreign or unusual emotion. It's actually something that I'm sure every single one of us has felt at some point or another in our lives. It's when the shame spiral begins to eat away at us, right? Another thing I want to mention about rage is deep intergenerational and environmental suppression expressed. So I'm going to say that again. Rage is deep intergenerational and or environmental oppression suppression expressed. So it's actually something deeply rooted that's trying to express itself, right? Like it's exploding out of the seams because it's been deeply, deeply suppressed. And in cases of oppression can be intergenerationally passed down. And so for those of you who connect with or do any kind of ancestral work, um, in ancestral lineage, we talk about karma in some cultures and religions. And so karma is a much more complex concept, but some of which is karma may be like ancestral rage or ancestral experiences. And so that can show up within you because what the idea is that what needed to be worked out or resolved in previous ancestral experiences with your other family members or your own ancestral lineage wasn't worked out. So then it gets passed on. And in your next life, you're still working on resolving it, right? And some of this can show up in various ways. I want to note that sometimes these emotions can be really intense when we're connecting with ancestral work, for those of you who do that work. Internalized conditioning. Is it yours, or has it been imposed upon you? And what I mean by this is, and when we have an internalized conditioning of an experience, we sometimes can't discern whether that's our own emotion and our own experience or what we're going through, or it's something that's been conditioned into us, right? Like a repetition or a narrative or a story. And some of these stories really are complex. They're intermingled with like joy and beauty and resilience, right? But they can also be connected with things that feel painful and harmful or have been harmful. And so, what are we carrying and bringing with us that is ours? And what is it that has been conditioned into us? And so that's an inquiry I'd like you to think about and to sit with and to consider as you begin to sift through some of these pieces that may be showing up. And if it isn't yours, it may be something then to release or to give back, or to work through, or maybe isn't even your journey to work through, right? So these are some things to consider. Almost all grief has a quality of trauma. And I often actually talk about grief as traumatic grief. Because even when we think about, and when I talk about quality of trauma, I'm talking about little t, right? Little t, big T would be like post-traumatic stress disorder. Little t would be traumatic experiences that maybe have some ripple effect on us, and that it's on a spectrum of what that ripple effect is. So almost all grief has a quality of trauma. So when you think about the grief that you're enduring now, or that you have endured in your life, and maybe the intergenerational grief that has been shared, or the connection of that, there's some level of that little t that can be part of your lived experience. And so, and that's really okay, right? I think, again, naming that, right? Saying like, of course, I am being affected by this. And in our society, we don't leave a lot of space for grief, right? Like they do like 3 days of bereavement. Everybody knows that and that's passing of somebody significant in your life. as you know, and I know, it's not 3 days of bereavement. And oftentimes can last for a lifetime. And it changes and moves and shifts and shows up in different ways. But that in some ways, our experience with grief is our dance with grief, right? Like we allow it to have space to show up as it shows up. Like you could wake up one day and be like, oh my goodness, like I just feel tremendous amounts of grief, and it might be connected to somebody in your life, right? It might be connected to a loss or separation. And grief isn't just about death, it's about losing aspects of ourselves or losing a relationship, right? It can show up in a lot of different ways. And so those things are really hard in our lives, and to allow ourselves to breathe into it. I think of this analogy of like when something shows up that's difficult, I actually have this visualization where I breathe into it. I actually create more space in my heart to like breathe into the grief. And so like saying, almost like holding it like with care. And so I imagine like breathing care into this emotions that are difficult, like the ones above that are listed here. Self-forgiveness is also an area worth addressing and looking at and working on. Shame and guilt are particular emotions that demonstrate that you often value the well-being of you others above your own. And this isn't always true, but I would say that in those that I've connected with and noticed like with high levels of shame and guilt, they often care so much, right, about others, their loved ones. They don't want to hurt the people in their lives, or they feel like when they want to, address it or take responsibility or accountability for it, right? And so I often notice this kind of trait among folks that carry a lot of guilt and shame, that they often really value the wellness of others and they will put others before themselves. And as beautiful and altruistic as that is, it can often make it difficult, right, for us to be able to address the shame and guilt in a real way, or in a way that's true, in a way that is reflective of what is actually occurring in the space in real time. And so some pathways, and we're going to talk about this later, some pathways to release emotions is through addressing the holistic body. And I've talked about this multiple times, but the physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual, right? Doing a checkpoint for each of these areas, because we are all of it. I think in the medical model and other kind of, even in mental health, right? Mental health really is looking at like emotional, cognitive. Physical health is looking at physical specifically. And then there's like spiritual healing work, right? And what I'm saying in this space is we are all those things. And so beginning to look at health as a holistic way of addressing all aspects of this part of being, right? Being human. And the last bit is actually an exercise I wanted to do with you as I'm talking about these different things and kind of being able to apply what we're talking about here, is gauging responsibility. And what I mean by that is there's this little exercise that I actually do with some of my teens, some of my adults, particularly clients that are struggling with some of the areas of guilt and shame, or maybe have a tendency to carry more responsibility than is theirs to carry. And so if you're able to, I'd like you can grab a piece of paper. You can do it on your phone. You don't have to grab a piece of paper. And I want you to imagine a pie chart. A pie chart, and the pie has different pieces of the pie. And so again, in this moment, take a moment, imagine a pie chart, or on your phone, you could just begin to think about sections on your phone if you want to take it in your notes. And in this moment, I'd like you to think about maybe something in your life that you intuitively know that you're carrying maybe a lot of the burden. Maybe you're carrying the weight of the responsibility of others, your family, maybe even intergenerationally. For some of us who come from, immigrant families, we may feel as though we're carrying the weight of needing to deliver. Like, my parents came to this country, I need to show up, I need to do, there's this kind of pressure. And so thinking about an example in your life where you may be carrying some extra guilt or shame or burden or pressure. And when you have this in your mind, I'd like you to begin to think about this pie chart where you're a piece of the pie, and noticing that as a piece of the pie, first question is, how much of the pie are you carrying? What percentage of the pie currently is what you're carrying? 80%, 100% even maybe, or 50? And just making a note of that. Now, I'd like you to note or pay attention to who else may be involved in this part of your pie that you're talking about here. Who, or environments, or scenarios, or systems. It might not just be who, right? It may be specific people, but it could be structures. It could be other pieces. And I just want you to begin to notice what those are. And if it's helpful to write those things down, go ahead and write those down. It's taking a moment to look at who actually is responsible and carries these pieces. You're one of them, and there are likely other people, systems, structures, environmental aspects involved. And some of that may be intergenerational as well. Make a note of that. I'm just giving a little bit of time here just because I know that it could take just a few moments to acknowledge, recognize, write down. And now with what you've seen, noticed, and recognized here, I'd like you to begin to reallocate your pie in a way that are part of what's showing up in these spaces. Yes, I'll have Leah put in the prompts. So in this pie, go ahead and begin to recalibrate. Recalibrate who is involved in the pieces of this pie and how much. And you might not even know, right? You might be like, I kind of have a sense of this. That's okay. So you could start with yourself, or you could start with others. Begin to write and connect with what are the pieces of the pie, who is involved in that, and actually, what percentage of responsibility do all of these folks, systems, etc., carry? All right. So I'm going to actually open up the space for this piece for folks who would like to share observations or things that they noticed as they're kind of gauging and connecting with what it is that they're holding and carrying and kind of the weight and responsibility, and maybe what shifted for you or what showed up for you as you engaged in this exercise together. You can also choose to unmute and connect as well. And if you didn't actually physically kind of write out the pieces, you can also reflect about what arose as you're hearing me kind of talk through this bit with you. Again, I'll just repeat what we did together. We first started with looking at something that may be challenging, something that we may be carrying, shame or guilt or a weight or burden of responsibility and pressure, and looking at how much of that piece of the pie that we're holding ourselves, whether put upon us or we chose for ourselves. Then we looked at this area of responsibility again and began to redistribute or take a look at who else was actually part of the responsibility here. Who else actually is involved that maybe we're not seeing. And from there, began to recalibrate and taking a look at the responsibility percentages and the ways that it would show up. And maybe begin to release and let up off of some of these pieces as we begin to look at pieces of the pie. So Leah put the prompt in, we'll be putting the prompt in here in case you want to take a look at it again. And since it's okay that folks may not be interested in participating at this point, and this can be for you, and I will move on. Oh, Christine, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, as a couples therapist trainee, I have been holding some guilt because one of my couples clients have decided to separate. And I started out by giving myself 1/4 of the pie and giving the two people like another, like they each got a fourth. But then as the exercise progressed, I kind of did an overlap where a huge part of the pie ended up being trauma on both ends.
Mm.
Capitalism became a big part, and I took a part of my fourth and divided it in half and put down gender roles.
Mm-hmm.
Started kind of looking at it from a macroscopic lens on why this relationship dissolved.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. What was it like for you as you were kind of moving through this process?
It was very illuminating because it was very easy for me to be in my head and
Mm-hmm.
not and to not see the forest for the trees, um,
Mm-hmm.
because there's such large forces at work on why some people succeed and some don't, why certain things work out and some don't, and it's easy to personalize things, and the system is in place so that we personalize things. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
thank you.
Anybody else would like to before we move on? Cora?
Hi, I have a question. It's I think having um like Asian background and a collectivistic background, it's a bit hard to separate the self
Mm-hmm.
when doing this pie chart. Because some, things that I do also feel like it's for myself too, even if it's for others or for other causes or system work, all that stuff. Like how do you how do you like separate them and like to make the pie of responsibility a bit more accurate?
I think and thank you so much for bringing this up. I'm absolutely sure that you're not the only one in this room that has this question and has this experience. And so I would actually say that for collectivist communities, what the pie chart looks like may be a little bit different, where it's like there's more like shading, where it's like there's moments where there's like room for a little bit more fluidity around that, right? So it might be like sometimes it's 40%. Sometimes it's 60% with overlap. We don't need to calculate it to like that degree. In some ways, we look at this pie as a little bit more like perspective, right? And so there's going to be room for it to kind of come over and to engage in this way that has more space and it's more like shading versus like hard lines. And I do want to note that generally we don't want to have really hard lines anyways, because it can sometimes restrict us from what is the reality of our lives, right? The other piece is something to note is enmeshment around collectivist communities and families where there's a level I think this is where Western psychology and Eastern cultural components don't always go quite well together. And it's worth noting, right? Where Bowinian may say, oh, enmeshment is a bad thing. We need to de-enmesh from family systems and we need to separate yourselves from and individualize yourself from your family. That's not something that, for example, in Asian cultures and other cultures, that is a part of how we engage with our family or how we connect with our lineage. It would be causing actually a high level of disruption and harm to our connection to our family, right? And so how that might look is it's not saying to not individuate, it's somewhere in between, right? Where it's like, do I find myself becoming very exhausted, for example? Does it feel like the kind of burden where I am constantly in this state of trying to catch up, like trying to take care of my parents. I'm trying to take care of my kids. I'm trying to make sure everything's good. My parents, I run errands for them. I'm totally fine doing it. I want to do that, right? I want to support them. I take them to their medical appointments, etc. I go for dinner twice a week, lots of different activities, right, with our family. And we want to do that. And we also want to check in with ourselves to be like, how am I doing? Am I burning myself out in doing that? What are places that that I can connect with quality, right? What we notice is that when we are doing a lot and maybe too much, we start to notice that the quality of connection begins to go down, right? It might feel or look like a task that we have to do and we can't not do it, right? There's this kind of intensity in the way that we put pressure on ourselves. And so how do we create a little bit of flexibility within that? And that's really in relationship with others and with ourselves. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I really appreciate you mentioning enmeshment without pathologizing it. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, folks, we'll move on. Thank you. So these are some pieces to connect with around intergenerational, racialized, cultural trauma, collective healing, resilience building aspects. Again, the top 3 talked about earlier, don't need to talk about again. Some tools and strategies for collective healing. So intergenerational resilience, something I talked about actually throughout the 3 parts of the series, which is identifying and noticing. What are the resilient aspects that you're bringing with you, carrying with you, and holding on for you and your future generations? And to really look at those gems and connect with them as much as some of the stories that have been really challenging. What are your cultural rituals and community? Who is your community? And as well as what are your cultural rituals? In some of our cultures, that's been taken away from us, right? We may not know what those cultural rituals are. We may not know like what aspects are ours or what has been, again, imposed upon us. And so this is something that can start with you. Sometimes we get hung up on like, what are those cultural rituals? Do I identify with that? What is it that I'm supposed to take with me? What am I not supposed to take with me? When being able to slow that down to be like, okay, we're starting with you. What are cultural rituals that matter to you? So for some folks, right, they've done ancestry and it has been helpful, and for others, not so helpful. And even for others, it's been actually a bit traumatic, right, to find out some of the information that came through ancestry. And so taking it as information, because the information is more or less factual or true of your global connection, right? And being able to then for yourself, what does that mean for you? What do you pick and choose? What do you want to pass on? What do you want to carry? And what do you want to practice? Those are choices for yourself and that you get to choose. Another piece is that you're not alone, right? Reminding yourself that you really are not. You're not alone, and there are folks in the community that are doing this work, that want to connect with you, and we're here, right? We're out here, and so noticing and knowing that you're not alone. Developing practices to release trauma. We're going to do some exercises together. These are later on, just in a couple slides. So some best practices treatment for intergenerational trauma. There are more than these. So for those of you who practice other areas of therapy or non-therapy related supportive work around releasing and treatment and trauma support or healing, these are some things to note or think about and consider. I'm not going to read them all. If you have particular interest in some of these areas, you can reach out to me. I'm not an expert on biofeedback or craniosacral. So those 2 areas, and I wouldn't say I'm a super expert in all of these areas, but I definitely have areas of expertise in some of these. But to most of these here, I can speak to biofeedback, just a little bit around that. But the other ones I can definitely talk more about and can expand on for folks if you have particular interest in any of these. You can also reach out to me later regarding them. Somatic psychotherapy is a kind of general psychotherapy aspect, but it can include specific training modalities like somatic experiencing from Peter Levine, etc. So there are definitely practitioners in areas of focus and training And these are aspects that are specific to LMFTs, PCCs, LCSW. So you need to be licensed and credentialed in order to engage in some of these areas of treatment. So I want to introduce some SAMHSA principles around trauma-informed care. And this is really for those of you who are practitioners or doing some of this work, which is looking and developing safety, trustworthy, and transparency. Some of these are probably no-brainers, but they're written in this way because, and sort of in this hierarchy a little bit, because we know that there may be an internalized lack of safety and externalized lack of safety, right? It can be happening in both directions. So how do we really build that container of safety? Ensuring collective or peer support. And so you are not the only one that is supporting the individual, but really building and connecting with their community of support as part of treatment. Collaboration and neutrality. So this is really a breaking down, talking about Western psychology, right? We are really talking about equalization of power. You are a partner with your client, right? You are in partnership and collaboration with their treatment. Looking at empowerment, voice, and choice. So again, agency, right? That your clients or others have agency in the choices they make. I talked about agency earlier too, with those of you who are not doing therapy, but like with your family, like they have agency to say, no, I don't want to talk about my history. I don't want to talk about the war, right? I don't want to talk about what happened before we immigrated here. They have agency in the choices they make. And so whatever that means for each individual, whatever that means for you, and as well as what it means for your clients, empowerment, voice, and choice is a critical aspect of this. And of course, cultural, historical, and gender aspects, issues, experiences. So really looking holistically as we're looking at trauma-informed approaches when working with your clients. Bora asked how much of the best practices of intergenerational modalities are covered as part of the training at CIIS Community Mental Health Program. I have a like way longer answer to this. So there's curriculum that's covering lots of different aspects for us. So we wouldn't say like, oh, intergenerational therapy is what we're doing per se, but it's interwoven kind of in everything, right? Because how do you not look at impact of like interpersonal dynamics, particularly when you're working with communities of colors, without looking at the intergenerational aspect of what's occurring, right? So it's not like a class on intergenerational trauma. It's really the way that it's interwoven into how we're connecting. And so that's what I would say about that. And you can also email me so we could chat a little bit more. You could set up time to talk with me if you like. So I want to close today with a brief exercise. And actually, I want to have time for Q&A. So if you can either do this now, or you could take a screenshot of this and do this on your own. And so this is something I do in my class. This is something I do in my training, developing practices to release trauma. If you'd like to take this with you, you screenshot it. Individual and collective healing toolkit. There are 5 areas. You don't have to do them all, but maybe one today and maybe later on this evening, I recommend and think about this. If folks would like to do the Q&A as well as share one of these, I would really love that. Either is fine. Identify one cultural ritual or practice that grounds you in your identity. Identify one intergenerational resilience characteristic that has been passed down. Identify 1 or 2 somatic movement practices that help release stress, tension, and trauma. Identify 1 creative expression that releases channel stress and trauma. What is 1 way you engage in community and creates a sense of belonging and support? And so usually I do this as an exercise as a collective group. And so it becomes really a collective toolkit of sharing. And people really resonate with one another as they're able to share some of these components and aspects as they're engaging with it. So you are more than welcome to share this. I'm sure other folks in the room will find it greatly beneficial. Or we can also move into Q&A. So thank you so much. Leah, we'll continue recording till the end, just in case folks decide to share these pieces. So the other folks who are just coming and watching the recording can also benefit from it. Thank you so much. Who would like to share? Albert shared about smudging, endurance training, cooking for others. Oh, I love that. I'm also a cook for other people. Mecca, yes, we can send the recording, and then Leah can screenshot this and she can also put it in the body of the email. Thank you. Also questions. So if folks have questions, you can choose to raise your hand. You can choose to put it in the Q&A section. Either is fine.
I can share, but I know I've been like speaking quite a bit, so I want to give other people opportunity if anyone else wants to share.
That's okay, Bora. Go ahead.
Okay. I really resonated you mentioning about the grief and how we don't have that much rituals around grieving. And in my healing, like personal healing process, being able to grieve well has been a huge kind of like unlocking of a lot of dimensions of healing. Um, and I found that healing as a community, really there's like something magical about it. And when I was trying to find like grief rituals or community around it, I couldn't find anything that was about like little G grief. So like griefs around like the little T trauma grief that you mentioned. That's not really about like losing a significant other, but like a daily loss of expectations, or like microaggressions, like racism, sexism. It can be just like, and I found that in order to keep like dreaming and keep maintaining sense of joy, it's been so important for me to grieve just constantly. Um, and I started actually because I couldn't find anything. I started hosting like a grief bonfire in my backyard and just inviting friends, and we like burn things together. And there's something about burning and also doing it as a group. We like I feel like the grief alchemizes into sense of connection and joy. So I've been trying to do more of that, and so that's been really powerful for me.
Yeah, thank you, Bora, for sharing. It's so true. I mean, who doesn't like to like burn up trauma or like burn up experience that you're like, I need to release this, right? This is also a very deeply rooted ritual that has existed since the beginning of humans, right? Like really talking about being in circle, fire, water, elements, right? Being in nature. These are not there. It's not just a coincidence that there is something really healing and releasing and connected about this, right? It has existed since the beginning of human existence. Amanda said, journaling has been huge for my healing and confrontation of my trauma. Yeah, the externalization of what's internally spiraling, right? There's a reason why like this journaling, it's like, it's a release, but it's also a processing that can happen. And so having some helpful prompts around how to process and provide that information, externalize that, and you can kind of reflect that back to you, that process can be incredibly helpful. Amanda shared that, other Amanda shared, my movement somatic practice is playing with ocean waves. So cute. My family cultural ritual is collectively naming gratitude, especially during family gatherings. It's beautiful, Amanda. Jen said perseverance, shaking things out, dancing. Dancing is a big one for me as well. But yeah, I didn't talk about this too much in the series, but around shaking, right? Animals shake after an attack to kind of release all of that, the stuff in the nervous system. Like in many ways, what is being affected is our visceral, animalistic, internal aspect. And so shaking is actually a really, really good practice. So standing up, shaking it off. Like, why do we say that? We're shaking it off, right? But we don't often actually shake. And so encouraging folks to do that if that feels like they feel in their body that feels like it could be helpful. Claudia mentioned, I love movement practices that allow for self-expression through dance and using the voice, sound to release tension and pent-up energy. Same as Albert, cooking and sharing meals. There's something here that Claudia is talking about, which is like the vibration of screaming, singing, the vibration of our voice. You know, I talked about this in a last 2 weeks ago around like silencing as a way of an oppressive aspect that has happened. And so for those who have been silenced, intergenerationally silenced, or silenced for survival, really working those vocal cords in various ways. And for people, it can be chanting, it could be speaking, it could be again, singing, screaming, going to the beach, going to mountaintop, screaming, right? There's something about activating the vocal cords and activating the throat chakra to really move that energy. Heather talked about smudging with guava leaves, Filipino culture, cooking with traditional recipes like sinigang. Oh my God, sinigang is my favorite, by the way. Shaking and breath work, journaling and painting, facilitating WOC and Filipinx healing circles. It's really awesome. Thank you, Heather. That's wonderful. Christine mentioned connecting to BIPOC BTS Army fans on Twitter, having a sense of humor, dance, karaoke, celebrating cultural holidays, and attending cultural events. It's beautiful. There's something about humor I kind of want to mention, which is like, you know how there's this thing that happens that sometimes you're in community and there's this moment where it's like uncontrollable laughter. And you might even start the conversation with something challenging or difficult, or sometimes you don't, but there's something about collective laughter and that it's contagious. And it's just kind of like, in that kind of laughter that comes from deep inside your stomach or in your gut. I love that. And you talk about release, right? Like there's some of these releases here, but I think there's something that happens in that moment where there's like releasing laughter out of like your gut. And so I appreciate everything that everyone shared today and you brought with you.